Okay, so as we told you, Joe Biden is in Tel Aviv, but his efforts to tamp down tensions in the war between Israel and Hamas faced massive setbacks even before he departed. Jordan called off the president's planned summit with Arab leaders after that deadly explosion at the Gaza hospital killed hundreds. As the crisis spirals, the Iranian foreign minister is in the Saudi city of Jeddah for an emergency meeting of OIC nations, the Organization of Islamic Conference. The role of Saudi Arabia remains hugely sensitive, and some analysts suggest moves to normalize the kingdom's own relationship with Israel could have been one of the motivations for the attack by Hamas. The emergency meeting of OIC nations becomes critical in this context. Remember, in March, Tehran and Riyadh agreed to reestablish relations after years of hostility. The Hamas-run health ministry in Gaza blamed an Israeli airstrike. The Israeli military said it had no involvement and pinned the blame on a misfired Palestinian rocket. Jordan's foreign minister said, and this is a quote, "The war and this aggression are pushing the region to the brink." He stated Jordan would only host the summit when all participants agreed on its purpose, which would be to stop the war and respect the humanity of the Palestinians. While in the air, Biden released a statement saying that he was outraged and deeply saddened by the explosion at the hospital and the terrible loss of life that resulted. He said he spoke immediately after hearing the news with King Abdullah of Jordan and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Prime Minister Netanyahu is blaming barbaric terrorists, but Biden has directed his national security team to continue gathering information about what exactly happened. He did make a comment that he said it appears that this explosion was made by, quote unquote, the other team. The cancellation of the Jordanian leg of the trip reflects an increasing volatile situation that will test the limits of American influence in the region. Russia and the United Arab Emirates called for an emergency UN Security Council meeting. UN chief called for immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Israel-Hamas conflict. And speaking at the Belt and Road Initiative Forum in China, Antonio Guterres, the UN chief, stated that Hamas attacks cannot justify the collective punishment of the Palestinian people.
I am horrified by the hundreds of people killed at Al-Ahli Hospital this same day in Gaza by a strike that I strongly condemned earlier today. I call for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire to provide sufficient time and space to help realize my two appeals and to ease the epic human suffering we are witnessing. Too many lives and the fate of the entire region hang on the balance. May the spirit of this meeting help those that need to find peace.
For more on this, we are now being joined by Heino Klink from Washington, D.C. He is the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia. Sir, thank you so much for joining us on WION. President Biden could not have possibly arrived at a more difficult time. This was a trip that was already being called a high-stake journey. Can you talk to us about how this deadly Gaza hospital strike has basically derailed President Biden's trip?
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. I would say that the president's trip into the region was high risk from the very beginning, not just obviously from a physical and security perspective, since he's traveling into a war zone, but also from a diplomatic and a political perspective. The tragic strike on the hospital in Gaza, it certainly bears the world condemnation. And it is unfortunate that in fact caused America's Arab partners, particularly the Jordanians and the Egyptians, to walk away from the summit that King Abdullah was going to host in Amman. I believe that for a longer term solution, the Arab states, the neighboring Arab states, need to be involved. It's again very unfortunate, both due to the large loss of civilian life at the hospital, as well as, again, from a diplomatic perspective, that meeting was canceled. And I'm sure that then reduced, obviously, the scope of what the president will be able to accomplish during his time in the region.
Yeah, I mean, the Jordanian queen is Palestinian. Jordan is home to so many Palestinians. The president's team at the White House tried to sort of gloss over this, said that it was the decision of both sides for this meeting to be canceled. But still, these Arab leaders are furious, and Biden had hoped to meet them, as you mentioned. But then they called it off, or maybe both sides called it off. But regardless, what would be the takeaway of this? I mean, moving forward, is it because it's President Biden, he doesn't have pull, or is it because they just don't want United States involved in the region?
Well, I think the Arab states, again, particularly Jordan and Egypt, have internal domestic political considerations that they need to take into account. Mm-hmm. As you mentioned, there's a large Palestinian population in Jordan. Egypt is concerned about, frankly, a large Palestinian refugee population within its borders. So they're playing a balancing act as well. On the one hand, I'm confident that neither one of those governments, if they could turn back the hands of time, the October 7th attack of Hamas on Israel is certainly something they would have not liked to have seen happen for all the obvious reasons, but perhaps also for a little less obvious reason, which is the instability that is being caused is going to have potentially effects on their countries as well. So they, on the one hand, are not advocates, opponents of Hamas's actions. On the other hand, they cannot appear as if they're leaning at all towards Israel. And of course, Israel's strongest ally and partner in the world is the United States. So Jordan and Egypt cannot appear as if they're leaning too closely to the United States either.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you talked about Egypt. They're concerned about Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas militants crossing over the border. They're dealing with their own issues, as you mentioned, internally. These hostages, the release of hostages is perhaps the most important aspect of this conflict, notably for those Americans who don't know where their loved ones are. Do you think that President Biden can play a role, at least during this short visit, to get some answers or perhaps provide some coordination with the Israeli military to give us some news about the hostages, or perhaps, to take Hamas by its word, they said that they're willing to release non-Israeli hostages. Can anything come out of this?
I'm not optimistic, to be perfectly candid. The brutality of Hamas is unparalleled. Let's remember that during the attack of October 7, people from over 30 countries were murdered, not just Israelis, not just Americans. And let's also remember that of the hostages that are being held, there's more than a dozen nationalities represented. I think if there's going to be any success whatsoever in getting hostages released, Qatar will play a significant role. We have to remember the political leadership of Hamas actually resides in Qatar. Let's remember also that Hamas gets a lot of its financial support from Qatar, not as much as they get from Iran, candidly, but Qatar does have some influence. And I am hopeful that Qatar will use all influence at its disposal to get hostages released. That being said, as I mentioned, Hamas is a terrorist organization. Their calculus is different than that of us that are living in civilized societies. I do not envision them giving up all the hostages, because that is a bargaining chip for them, and they will want to leverage that as much as they possibly can.
Mr. Heino Klink, thank you so much for joining us, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia in Washington, D.C. this morning, and I look forward to speaking to you again very soon.
Thank you.